In a previous video, you learned how to mix watercolor on your palette to achieve the intermediate color that you desire and to achieve the strength of color that you desire. In this video, we'll learn how to blend two colors on paper, moving from one color to the other within a shape or from a lighter to darker value within a shape. You'll need your usual watercolor setup and a 1/16 sheet of watercolor paper on which you draw 5 bars separated by gaps, like this. Be sure to leave a little space in between the bars so that your colors don't run into each other. Make a nice puddle of strong yellow color and a nice puddle of strong red color. If you do not know how to do this, you can watch the video on mixing vibrant, juicy color. Now, load your brush with plenty of yellow paint and begin filling the first bar, starting on the left, with the yellow paint. Because we'll be blending on dry paper in this first example, this is called blending wet on dry. Load your brush as often as necessary to develop a bead. Keep working with the yellow paint, loading the brush as often as you need to keep the bead going until you've covered about 3/4 of an inch. Then, drag just a little bit of the red color out onto your palette and mix it with the yellow to make a somewhat intermediate color, and continue with that. Continue to load your brush each time with a bit more red, each time making sure to maintain the bead as you go. Maintaining a bead means that there is liquid paint to mix on the paper and will assist in blending the two colors on the page as well as on the palette. Continue working, adding a little bit more of the red paint to your mixture each time you load your brush. Notice that I'm using the method that we learned in the mechanics of mixing, keeping a little of each color pure so that I can use it to adjust my mixing puddle to the color that I want. And I'm being careful to maintain a bead as I go so that the liquid at the leading edge of this shape that I'm making helps me blend the color on the page. Don't be too concerned with exactly how the blend goes this time, just learn the process. If you've maintained a bead, you'll likely have extra paint at the end, which you can drink up with a thirsty brush. We're going to repeat this exercise with the same two colors and a variation in technique. So if necessary, go ahead and replenish your pure color puddles so that you have plenty of paint to work with as we begin the next phase. I'm going to begin this next part of the exercise by painting that blank bar with clear water. So let me check first and make sure that the water in my rinse container is still clear enough. Often it looks like it's got color in it, but when you put it out on a test sheet, you'll see that there's really very little color. I'm going to paint the entire bar with clear water. My goal is to get it uniformly wet, but not drippy. Usually this is easiest to achieve by using plenty of water and then drinking up any excess at the end with a thirsty brush. Because we'll be working on wet paper this time, this is called wet into wet. Some people call this wet into wet within a shape because the whole page is not wet, just the area that we're going to paint. Now begin again on the left side with the yellow paint, except that you'll notice that this time, because the paper is already wet, instead of developing a bead, the paint begins to migrate on its own into the adjacent area. This is another way of assisting the paint to blend on the paper. Continue as you did in the first example, adding a little red at a time, working your way across the bar until you're using just red at the far end. When you've finished, drink up any excess with a thirsty brush. Now, just as we did with mixing color on our palette, we can also let clear water play the role of one of the colors in this technique, working from a stronger version of a color to a more dilute version, or vice versa. Just for fun, I'm going to work with blue paint, so I'm going to clear some space on my mixing surface. Now mix up a nice, strong, juicy puddle of blue and begin filling the next bar on the left side with full strength, liquid, juicy blue color. As always, when laying a wash, be sure that you maintain a bead on the leading edge. Now, using your brush like an eyedropper, bring some clear water out onto your palette and mix it with the blue paint on your palette. You probably won't see a great deal of change initially because there is still quite a bit of blue paint in the bead on the paper. It's only when you've moved a little bit down that you can see that the color has lightened just a little bit. Continue moving across the page, adding a little bit more water to your mixture each time, making a paler and paler version of your color. Dry your brush and mop up the excess water with a thirsty brush. Now let's replenish our pure color puddle and try the same exercise, again wet on dry, starting with a pale color and working towards the darker color. The first thing I'll do is rinse my brush and use almost clear water. I'll tint it just a little bit and begin on the left side with the pale version of the color. Again, notice that I'm carrying enough water in my brush to develop a bead. Work your way across the page, adding a little more blue each time until you're using your pure color blue at the far end. In the last bar, we'll practice this wet and wet. So again, I'm checking to make sure that my water is still clean enough. And then I'm going to paint the last bar with clear water. Once again, I'm looking for an even film of water with no drips. The blue on my palette looks like it's a little diluted, so I'm mixing up a little bit more strong pure color to begin on the left side. It would have been smart to do that first because my paper is drying while I'm mixing. Beginning on the left, wet and wet with the pure blue and gradually adding a little more water. Once again, you see that rather than having a bead, the paint begins to migrate on its own into the wet paper. Notice how the paint is accumulating and running down the edge with the tape. Don't be concerned about this. In a finished painting, that part would wind up under the mat and no one would ever see it. So if it's not perfectly smooth right there, it usually doesn't matter. Now you know two ways to blend color on your paper as well as on your palette, working wet on dry and working wet into wet. Washes that blend from one color to another or from a darker version of a color to a paler version are called graduated or graded washes and are a hallmark of watercolor. It's well worth practicing this exercise many different times with different pigments as each pigment behaves somewhat differently. And different brushes, different types of paper, and even differences in humidity can make some difference in how the washes turn out.